The chandeliers of the Marchmont ballroom cast their golden light upon 300 of London's finest, their brilliance reflecting off silk gowns and jewelled throats. Yet somehow the shadows seemed to gather most thickly in the corner where Lady Beatrice Ashford stood. The wallpaper behind her displayed an intricate pattern of climbing roses, though none so faded as she had become over 4 interminable seasons, pressed against damask and plaster, while the dancers whirled past in configurations that never included her. She had learned to hold herself with a particular stillness, a quiet dignity that some mistook for pride, and others for simple dullness. Her gloved hands folded at her waist, her expression composed into something that might pass for serene contentment if one did not look too closely at her eyes. The whispers had a texture she had come to know intimately, like the brush of moth wings against one's cheek in darkness, there, always there, but never quite substantial enough to confront directly. 4 seasons, Lady Pemberton's voice carried from behind a fan, pitched just loud enough to ensure Beatrice would hear. And still no prospect at all, poor creature. The murmurs of agreement rippled outward like stones cast into still water, and Beatrice felt each one strike, though her expression never wavered. She had been 17 when she first entered these glittering rooms, her mother's hopes as carefully arranged as the flowers adorning her hair, her father's guilt already beginning to etch lines around his mouth, though she had not understood why then. Now she was 20, and the debutantes from her first season were matrons with children, their complexions softened by contentment, while hers had merely paled from the endless waiting. "I have become invisible," she thought, watching a cluster of younger girls glide past without a glance, their laughter bright as bells. Or perhaps worse, I have become visible only as an object of pity. The season of 1817 was declared the most brilliant in memory, the ballrooms overflowing with eligible gentlemen returned from the continent, the marriage market flourishing with unusual vigour, and yet she remained unclaimed, unwanted, a persistent reminder that not every story ended as it should. Lord Hartley swept past with Miss Caroline Dewsbury, and Beatrice remembered when his mother had suggested her as a suitable match just last year, remembered the horror that had flickered across his face, quickly masked, but not quickly enough. Near the refreshment table, 3 debutantes in their first season stood in a tight cluster, their eyes upon her, and then came the laughter, not hidden behind fans or muffled by gloves, but open and bright and cruel, the kind of laughter that says, "Thank heavens, I am not her." Beatrice's fingers tightened imperceptibly against each other, the only outward sign that she had heard, that she understood perfectly well. She had become the cautionary tale mothers whispered to their daughters, the spectre of failure haunting every wallflower corner, the laughingstock of every season. 3 years prior, when Beatrice had been 17 and still harboured foolish notions about romance and destiny, her father had summoned her to his study with a face like ash, the morning light filtering through windows that overlooked gardens her mother could no longer afford to maintain properly, and she had known before he spoke that something fundamental had shifted in the architecture of her life. Lord Ashford had never been a strong man, his weakness manifesting not in cruelty, but in that peculiar cowardice that drives men to gaming tables and promissory notes, to the gradual dissolution of estates through cards and dice, and the desperate hope that the next hand would restore everything the last had lost. And now the reckoning had come due in ways that made his hands tremble as he explained. "There is a gentleman," he had said, unable to meet her eyes, "the Duke of Ashcroft, who has proposed a solution to our difficulties." She had heard of Sebastian Thorne only in the way one hears of distant storms, through reputation and rumour, a man of 30 who moved through society like a shadow when he moved through it at all, his appearances so rare that his presence at any gathering occasioned immediate speculation, his origins mysterious despite his title. Some said his mother had been foreign, others whispered of scandal in his lineage, but all agreed he possessed a power that transcended mere wealth or position. The meeting had been arranged for that very afternoon, and Beatrice had entered the drawing-room to find him standing by the window, tall and dark-haired, with eyes that seemed to assess everything and reveal nothing. His bearing suggesting a man accustomed to command, yet somehow separate from the world he commanded. And when he had turned to face her, she had felt the peculiar sensation of being truly seen for the first time in her life. "Lady Beatrice," he had said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of Oxford and something else beneath, something harder. "I shall be direct, as our time is limited, and I have no patience for the usual social pleasantries. Your father owes debts that will destroy your family utterly unless they are resolved, and I am prepared to settle them in their entirety in exchange for a binding marriage contract between us." The words had fallen like stones into still water, and she had stood frozen while he continued, laying out terms that seemed drawn from Gothic novels rather than London drawing-rooms. They would sign a contract immediately, the marriage legally binding, but kept entirely secret for 3 years, while he attended to what he called affairs of state that require my complete attention and brook no distraction. And at the end of that period he would claim her publicly as his duchess if she had honoured the secrecy absolutely. "I understand this is unconventional," he had said, and something in his expression had softened almost imperceptibly. "But I give you my word as a gentleman that in 3 years, when my affairs are settled, I shall claim you publicly, and you will want for nothing." She had looked at her father's desperate face, at her mother's worn gloves visible through the doorway, at the faded curtains that spoke of genteel poverty approaching, and she had said simply, "I accept," sealing her fate with 2 words, and watching Sebastian Thorne produce a marriage contract already prepared, already signed by witnesses she did not know, requiring only her signature to transform her from disappointed debutante to secret duchess, bound by law and honour to a man who promised everything and revealed nothing, who spoke of 3 years as though time itself would bend to his will, whose eyes held secrets she could not begin to fathom, as she took the pen and wrote her name in ink that dried black as a raven's wing. The double life Beatrice led had carved her into 2 distinct persons, each as real as the other, yet never quite reconciled. The first a figure of quiet endurance who stood against ballroom walls accepting the whispered assessments of her inadequacy with downcast eyes. The second a woman who twice each week slipped through the servants' entrance of a townhouse in Mayfair, where Sebastian Thorne awaited her with books selected for her particular interests and questions that suggested he had been thinking of her in the hours between their meetings. The arrangement had specified secrecy, but not separation, and so these clandestine evenings had become the punctuation marks in her otherwise monotonous existence, moments when she could shed the weight of public failure and exist simply as herself, though what herself meant had grown increasingly complicated as the months accumulated into years. On a Tuesday in late May, she arrived at his residence as dusk settled over London, the streets still warm with the day's heat, and was shown not to the formal drawing-room, but to a smaller dining-room, where candles cast soft light over a table set for 2, the informality of it striking her as almost domestic, almost like a real marriage rather than a contractual obligation. Sebastian rose when she entered, his movements carrying that particular grace she had learned to associate with him, a fluidity that suggested physical training beyond what most gentlemen possessed, and when he pulled out her chair she caught the scent of sandalwood and something sharper, ink perhaps, as though he had come directly from correspondence to dine with her. "I thought we might discuss the Minerva translation you mentioned last week," he said as the first course was served, his dark eyes meeting hers with what seemed like genuine interest, and she found herself relaxing incrementally, the tension she carried through every ballroom easing in this private space where no one observed or judged or found her wanting. They spoke of Marcus Aurelius and the Stoics, of translation philosophy, and whether meaning could truly survive the journey from one language to another. And Beatrice heard herself offering opinions she would never voice in society, arguments that would mark her as unfeminine and unsuitably intellectual. Yet Sebastian listened with an attention that felt like recognition, occasionally disagreeing with points that made her defend her position more vigorously, his rare smile appearing when she made a particularly clever connection. "He sees me," she thought, watching candlelight play across his features as he poured more wine. "Truly sees me in ways no one else does, and yet he maintains such careful distance, as though I am a puzzle to be studied rather than a wife to be cherished." When their hands accidentally brushed, reaching for the same book he had brought to illustrate a point, he withdrew immediately, that shuttered expression descending over his face like a curtain, and she felt the familiar ache of wanting something more than their contract allowed, the dangerous stirring of genuine feeling for a man who had promised her nothing beyond eventual public acknowledgement. The evening ended as it always did, with Sebastian escorting her to the servants' entrance where her maid waited, his farewell formal and correct, and Beatrice returned to her family's house carrying the knowledge that tomorrow she would again be the wallflower, the object of pity, while this version of herself, the one who debated philosophy with a duke in candlelight, would retreat into shadow until their next appointed meeting, this strange division of self becoming ever more difficult to bear. Lady Pemberton's garden party arrived with the June roses in full bloom, their cloying sweetness hanging heavy in the air as Beatrice stood beside the refreshment table, trying to make herself invisible, a skill she had perfected over 4 seasons of social failure, watching her mother's increasingly desperate attempts at cheerful conversation with women who had long since written off the Ashford family as unimportant, their declining fortunes evident in everything from her mother's outdated gown to the absence of invitations to the most prestigious events. The garden itself mocked her with its abundance, climbing roses and manicured hedges speaking of wealth her own family no longer possessed, and she had positioned herself near the fountain, where the sound of falling water might cover the whispers she knew followed her like shadows, though today even that small mercy failed her. Utterly hopeless, Lady Worthington's voice carried across the roses with that particular clarity that suggested she either did not care or actively wished to be overheard. 4 seasons and not a single serious prospect, though one can hardly blame the gentleman when the girl has neither fortune nor beauty to recommend her. Beatrice's hand tightened on her teacup until the delicate porcelain threatened to crack, her face maintaining its careful composure, while something inside her withered, and she watched Lady Pemberton nod in solemn agreement, adding that it was a shame, really, what Lord Ashford's weakness had done to his daughter's prospects, as though Beatrice were not standing mere yards away, as though she were already a ghost haunting the edges of society. The afternoon descended into fresh humiliation when Lord Hartley, a pleasant if unremarkable gentleman of modest fortune, approached under what Beatrice recognized immediately as his mother's forceful direction, the older woman's hand on his elbow propelling him forward with visible determination, and Beatrice steeled herself for whatever awkward conversation was to follow. "Lady Beatrice," he began, his discomfort evident in the way he could not quite meet her eyes, "my mother suggested I might ask if you would care to view the conservatory." But before Beatrice could formulate a response, his mother materialized at his side with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass, declaring loudly that she had been mistaken, that Lord Hartley was expected at another engagement entirely, her message clear to everyone within earshot. Even charitable pity had its limits, and association with Beatrice Ashford had become too damaging to contemplate. Beatrice watched them retreat with her chin held high, though her vision blurred treacherously, and across the garden she caught sight of her father turning away from the scene, guilt etched in every line of his posture, unable to face what his weakness had cost his daughter, while her mother's worried face appeared and disappeared among the crowd like a pale moon behind clouds. The final blow came as afternoon faded toward evening, and the assembled company gathered to hear the Viscount Blackwood announce his daughter Margaret's engagement to the Earl of Somerset's heir, the collective approval and celebration throwing into sharp relief everything Beatrice lacked, and she stood applauding with the rest, while her younger sister Caroline touched her arm with sympathy that somehow hurt worse than mockery, whispering that Beatrice's time would come, though both knew the words for the kindness they were, empty of conviction. That night, Beatrice sat alone in her chamber after her family had retired, the sounds of London filtering through her window, and allowed herself to wonder for the first time if Sebastian Thorne had been real at all, or merely some elaborate fantasy her desperate mind had constructed, whether those candle-lit dinners and philosophical conversations existed anywhere but in her imagination, because surely no man of such power and position would bind himself to society's most pitied failure. Surely the contract itself was delusion born of her father's shame and her own need to believe salvation possible. The 3-year mark approached with autumn, mere months away now, and Beatrice found herself simultaneously dreading and longing for its arrival, knowing that when Sebastian failed to claim her publicly as promised, the last fragile hope sustaining her through these years of humiliation would die, and she would finally have to accept herself as society saw her, utterly hopeless, destined for spinsterhood or worse, the governess position or companion role that awaited women without fortune or prospects, her education and intelligence meaningless in a world that valued only beauty and connections she did not possess. Sebastian Thorne stood in the shadows of Lady Pemberton's garden party watching Beatrice Ashford endure her latest humiliation with that same quiet dignity that had begun to haunt his thoughts in ways the contract had never anticipated. Her spine straight as Lord Hartley's mother pulled her son away, as though Beatrice carried some contagion. And Sebastian felt his jaw tighten with an anger he had no right to feel, given that he himself was the architect of her isolation, having bound her to secrecy while he navigated the treacherous political waters that had threatened to swallow his family's legacy whole. The matter had begun 5 years prior, when his uncle's involvement in a failed plot against the Crown had cast suspicion upon the entire Ashcroft line, and Sebastian had spent those years methodically dismantling the network of conspirators, gathering evidence to prove his family's loyalty, while simultaneously rooting out those who would use his name for treason, dangerous work that required absolute discretion and left no room for the vulnerability a publicly acknowledged wife would represent. His enemies were not men who observed gentlemanly codes of honor. They were shadows who struck at families, at loved ones, at anyone who might provide leverage. And so when Lord Ashford's gambling debts had presented an opportunity to secure a future wife while maintaining complete secrecy, Sebastian had seen it as perfect timing, a way to fulfill his duty to provide an heir while keeping any potential duchess safely anonymous until the threats were neutralized. What he had not anticipated was Beatrice herself, the way her mind worked through problems with a precision that rivaled his own, her unexpected humor emerging in their private conversations, the particular tilt of her head when she considered a new idea. And somewhere between their first awkward dinner and their most recent discussion of Herodotus, he had stopped seeing her as a contractual obligation and begun seeing her as the woman he found himself thinking of when he should have been focused on matters of state and survival. From his position in the shadows, he watched her collect herself after Hartley's rejection, saw the moment her composure threatened to crack before she forced it back into place, and he wanted to cross that garden and announce to every sneering aristocrat exactly who she was to him. But the latest intelligence from his network made such revelation impossible. Not yet. Not when Lord Pemberton himself was proving to have connections to the very conspiracy Sebastian was dismantling, not when exposure might mean Beatrice becoming a target rather than a duchess. The investigation had reached its critical junction that very week, his agents closing in on the final proof needed to bring the conspiracy to light and clear the Ashcroft name completely. But the men involved were growing desperate, and desperate men were unpredictable, dangerous, capable of striking at anything Sebastian valued if they discovered what he valued most. He had 3 months remaining on the contract, 3 months until the promised public claiming, and Sebastian found himself torn between the protective instinct that had kept her safe through obscurity and the growing certainty that watching her suffer society's disdain while he did nothing was a different kind of cruelty, perhaps worse than any threat his enemies might pose. "Can I truly bring her into my world?" he wondered, watching Beatrice slip away from the garden party with her mother's worried face following her retreat. "Can I expose her to the dangers that circle my life like wolves? Or would claiming her publicly be the greatest selfishness, trading her social suffering for physical peril?" The decision loomed before him as he disappeared into London's evening streets, knowing that whatever choice he made would alter both their lives irrevocably, and hoping he possessed wisdom enough to choose correctly. Weeks passed with the peculiar weight of summer sliding toward autumn, and their clandestine meetings continued with a regularity that had become the fixed point around which Beatrice's existence revolved. Tuesday and Friday evenings, when she would slip through the servants' entrance of Sebastian's Mayfair residence under cover of twilight, the household staff long since trained to discretion, greeting her with respectful nods as though her presence were the most natural thing in the world, rather than a secret that would shock London society to its foundations. The library had become their customary meeting place, a room of floor-to-ceiling mahogany shelves and deep leather chairs positioned before a fireplace that Sebastian kept burning even in mild weather, claiming he preferred the light of flames to candles for reading. And it was there that Beatrice discovered the man beneath the Duke's austere reputation, his unexpected passion for Greek philosophy, and his detailed knowledge of botanical sciences, subjects he discussed with an enthusiasm that transformed his usually reserved features into something approaching warmth. One evening in late August, she arrived to find him already engrossed in a volume of Plutarch, his coat discarded over a chair, and his cravat loosened in a way that suggested he had forgotten the formality that governed his public existence. And when he looked up at her entrance, something flickered in his grey eyes that made her breath catch, a recognition that seemed to see past the wallflower society had labelled her, and into the woman she was when freed from their cruel assessment. "I have been thinking about our last discussion," he said, rising with that unconscious grace that marked his every movement, "regarding the nature of duty versus desire, and I find your argument more compelling upon reflection than I initially admitted." They fell into conversation as easily as breathing, debating whether Aristotle's conception of eudaimonia could be achieved through obligation alone or required elements of genuine choice. And Beatrice found herself arguing with a passion she never displayed in society's carefully monitored drawing rooms, her intelligence finally given space to unfold without fear of being labelled unfeminine or presumptuous. The hours dissolved around them until Sebastian's butler appeared with the discreet cough that indicated the lateness of the hour, and Beatrice realized with a start that they had been talking for nearly 4 hours, the fire burned low and the candles guttering in their holders, time passing in that suspended way it did when one was wholly engaged with another mind. As Sebastian walked her to the servants' entrance, a ritual that had become their habit, his hand brushed against hers in the narrow corridor, and neither pulled away immediately, the contact lasting perhaps 3 seconds longer than propriety allowed, and Beatrice felt heat climb her neck at the intimacy of it, this small touch somehow more significant than any words they had exchanged. "Beatrice," he said softly, her Christian name still sounding strange in his formal mouth, "I want you to know that these evenings have become—" But whatever he intended to say was cut short by his own restraint, the contract's boundaries rising between them like a wall, and he stepped back with visible effort, his jaw tightening. She wanted to close the distance, to demand he finish the thought, to ask if he felt this growing connection that seemed to be weaving itself between them with every shared idea and lingering glance. But her own caution held her frozen, unwilling to risk the fragile hope beginning to take root in her chest. The moment passed, and she slipped out into the London night, carrying the ghost of his unfinished sentence, while beyond the walls of their secret meetings, her sister Caroline received her 3rd marriage proposal that week, and their mother fretted openly about what was to become of Beatrice, whose fourth season was drawing to its mortifying close with no prospects whatsoever, society's mockery growing bolder as her situation grew more desperate, though none of them knew that in the quiet sanctuary of Sebastian's library something was shifting between contractual obligation and genuine regard, slowly, cautiously, like spring flowers pushing through the last stubborn snow of winter. The September air carried the first whisper of autumn's approach, when Beatrice sat in her family's morning room, enduring what would prove to be the most excruciating conversation of her entire four-season ordeal. Lady Worthington's well-meaning but devastating suggestion hanging in the air like smoke that refused to dissipate. Her words precise and careful as she explained that her cousin's family in Yorkshire required a governess for their 3 daughters, and perhaps dear Beatrice might consider the position given her unfortunate circumstances. The implication clear that spinsterhood was no longer a distant possibility, but an approaching certainty that required practical planning. 1 month remained until the 3-year deadline Sebastian had promised, 1 month until he was supposed to claim her publicly, but sitting in that sun-filled room watching her mother's face crumple with resignation, Beatrice felt the foundation of her hope beginning to crack, because her mother was nodding, actually nodding, tears streaming down her face as she agreed that perhaps it would be for the best, that Beatrice had always been good with children, and a respectable position was preferable to becoming a burden on Caroline's future household. Her father remained conspicuously absent from the discussion, his guilt over the gambling debts that had necessitated the secret contract keeping him confined to his study, where he could avoid witnessing the consequences of his failures. And Beatrice sat very still with her hands folded in her lap, thinking how fitting it would be if she ended her days teaching other women's daughters, while her own marriage remained a secret that would die with her, a contract fulfilled in letter, but never in spirit. Meanwhile, across London in his study at the Ashcroft residence, Sebastian received intelligence from his most trusted agent that made his blood run cold, not merely information about the conspiracy he had been dismantling, but evidence that his enemies had begun investigating his private life, asking questions about his movements on Tuesday and Friday evenings, making inquiries among servants, and the agent's final words carried a warning that could not be ignored, that any weakness Sebastian possessed would be discovered and exploited without mercy. The timing was catastrophic, because his network had also brought him news of the governess position, of Beatrice's mother weeping her agreement, of Lady Worthington's kindly meant assassination of whatever remained of Beatrice's social standing, and Sebastian found himself pacing his study like a caged wolf, trying to determine which danger was greater, the threat to Beatrice's life, if he claimed her now while his enemies circled, or the destruction of her spirit, if he allowed her to slip away into the anonymity of paid employment. His investigation was nearly complete. 3 more weeks, and he would have sufficient evidence to bring before the Crown, to clear his family's name and eliminate the threats that had necessitated secrecy. But 3 weeks might as well be 3 years if Beatrice accepted that position and disappeared into Yorkshire, beyond his reach, beyond society's mockery perhaps, but also beyond any chance of the future he had begun to envision in those quiet evenings when her laughter filled his library and her mind challenged his assumptions about duty and desire. The choice crystallized before him with brutal clarity: keep her safe through continued anonymity and lose her entirely to a life of genteel servitude, or risk everything by claiming her now, 1 month early, while his enemies still had power to strike, and the danger remained tangible and real. And Sebastian stood at his window watching London's streets fill with evening shadows, wondering if he possessed the courage to choose her happiness over her safety, or if he would prove himself a coward who hid behind noble justifications, while the woman he had come to need more than he had ever intended slipped through his fingers into a future that did not include him at all. The Marchfield ball arrived on a Thursday evening, thick with the scent of forced hothouse roses and the brittle gaiety of London's elite, celebrating what seemed an endless succession of betrothals, and Beatrice stood in her customary position near the potted palms, watching the ballroom transform into a theatre of announcements as couple after couple stepped forward to receive society's congratulations, including Eleanor Hartwick, who had debuted the same season as Beatrice and was now expecting her second child, and Margaret Thornbury, who had been considered plain until her substantial dowry attracted a viscount, and even shy little Anne Weatherby, who had married a country squire and seemed genuinely content despite his lack of title. Each announcement felt like a small death, a reminder that 4 years had passed since Beatrice's own debut, and she stood exactly where she had begun, except older now and more thoroughly dismissed, the young debutantes of this season not even bothering to mock her anymore, but simply looking through her as though she were part of the wallpaper pattern, not threatening enough to warrant cruelty, and not interesting enough to warrant acknowledgement. Lady Pemberton approached with that particular expression of saccharine concern that aristocratic women perfected for delivering social assassinations, her fan fluttering as she said in a voice pitched to carry to the nearby listeners, "Dear Beatrice, I have been meaning to speak with you about your future. Surely you must know that spinsterhood is nothing to be ashamed of in this modern age. Why, my own cousin never married, and she runs a very respectable household in Bath, quite content with her independence, I assure you." And something in Beatrice's chest cracked, hearing her worst fears spoken aloud as established fact, spinsterhood no longer a possibility to be avoided, but an inevitability to be embraced with whatever dignity she could muster. She felt her composure beginning to fracture. That careful mask she had maintained through 4 seasons of humiliation, slipping as Lady Pemberton continued with her kindly meant destruction, suggesting that Beatrice might consider the governess position Lady Worthington had mentioned, that there was no shame in honest employment, that some women were simply not destined for marriage, and it was better to accept this truth than to continue suffering the disappointment of hope. And Beatrice heard herself making some polite response, though she could not afterward remember what she had said, her body moving on instinct as she excused herself and walked with measured steps toward the terrace doors, maintaining her dignity until she reached the garden, where the September night received her with cool mercy, and she finally allowed herself to break. Standing among the sculpted hedges with London's lights glittering in the distance, Beatrice pressed her hands against her face and let herself ask the question she had been suppressing for months. What if Sebastian had never been real? What if those evenings in his library had been elaborate theatre performed for reasons she could not fathom? What if the contract itself was some cruel joke, and she had built her entire existence around a fantasy that would dissolve like morning mist, leaving her with nothing but 4 wasted years and a reputation for being too foolish even to recognize her own insignificance? But even as despair threatened to consume her entirely, something deeper rose up in resistance, a core of strength forged in those very years of mockery, and Beatrice straightened her spine and wiped her eyes, thinking that she would survive this, just as she had survived everything else, that with or without Sebastian's promised claim, she possessed value that society's shallow assessment could not diminish, that she would accept the governess position if necessary, and build a life of purpose, even if it was not the life she had imagined. And she turned back toward the ballroom, carrying this hard-won resolution like armor against whatever further cruelties the evening might hold. Sebastian had been standing in the shadows of the Marchfield terrace when Beatrice fled Lady Pemberton's poisoned kindness, his presence at the ball unremarked, because he had perfected the art of observing without being observed, and he watched through the glass doors as she stood among the sculpted hedges, with her hands pressed to her face in a gesture of such profound despair that something fundamental shifted inside his chest. Not the dutiful concern of a man honoring a contract, but the visceral anguish of witnessing someone precious in pain. And in that crystallizing moment, Sebastian understood with perfect clarity that what he felt for Beatrice Ashford had long since transcended obligation into territory far more dangerous and infinitely more necessary. The realization should not have surprised him, because looking back, he could identify the precise moment his careful detachment had begun to crumble. 3 months passed, when she had stayed late after one of their Tuesday meetings and encountered his elderly butler Hendricks struggling with the silver service, his arthritic hands making the simple task nearly impossible, and instead of pretending not to notice as any proper lady might have done, Beatrice had moved to help him with such natural grace that the old man's dignity remained intact, speaking to him about her own grandmother's difficulties with similar tasks and asking his advice on remedies as though seeking wisdom rather than offering charity. And Sebastian had watched from the doorway thinking that he had never seen kindness executed with such intelligence, such profound respect for another person's humanity regardless of their station. That memory rose now with devastating force as he watched her straighten her spine in the garden and turn back toward the ballroom, carrying whatever fragile resolution she had forged in her moment of breaking. And Sebastian felt the careful architecture of his planning collapse, because what did his investigation matter? What did his enemy's threats signify? What value did his own safety possess if it meant allowing this woman to slip away into a life of genteel servitude because he had been too cautious to claim her when it mattered most? The choice that had tormented him for weeks suddenly became simple. Her happiness mattered more than his security. Her future mattered more than his strategic positioning. Her right to be recognized and honored mattered more than every political calculation he had made over the past 3 years, and Sebastian turned from the terrace with his decision made and his course set, regardless of consequences. He would announce their betrothal at the Hastings ball in 2 days' time, 1 month before the contract's expiration, while his investigation remained incomplete and his enemies still circled. Because keeping Beatrice safe through obscurity had proven impossible when society itself had become her tormentor, and if danger came for them both, then they would face it together rather than separately, as husband and wife rather than as parties to a secret contract that had outlived whatever limited purpose it had once served. The preparation began immediately, with messages sent to his solicitor and his man of business, with instructions delivered to his household staff and his tailor, with a particular letter drafted to the Marquis of Hastings requesting a private word before the ball. And through it all, Sebastian carried the image of Beatrice, standing alone in that garden, choosing survival over despair, thinking that she deserved so much more than mere survival, that she deserved recognition and celebration, and a future filled with the kind of joy that society had denied her through its shallow cruelty. And he would give her that future, even if it cost him everything he had spent 3 years protecting, because she had become infinitely more valuable than his own carefully preserved security. The message arrived on Saturday morning, delivered by Sebastian's footman to the Ashford residence, a simple card requesting Beatrice's presence that evening at their usual meeting place, and she held the heavy paper stock between trembling fingers, thinking that this must be the end, that he had decided the contract was too burdensome or too dangerous, or simply too inconvenient now that the 3-year mark approached, and she dressed that evening with the careful precision of someone preparing for execution, choosing her plainest gown because there seemed no point in pretense any more, arriving at his Mayfair residence just as twilight painted the windows gold, and finding Sebastian waiting in the library, where they had spent so many Tuesday evenings discussing philosophy and literature, as though they were friends rather than parties, bound by her father's desperation and his own inscrutable purposes. He stood when she entered, and something in his expression made her breath catch. Not the careful courtesy he usually maintained, but something raw and less controlled. And before she could steel herself properly, he said in a voice that carried none of his customary detachment, "I owe you an apology. That 3 years cannot adequately convey, Beatrice. I have watched you endure humiliation that was partly of my making. I have maintained this arrangement for reasons that seemed compelling at the time, but now appear merely cowardly, and I have allowed you to believe yourself unloved, when the truth is that I—" But he stopped there as though the words themselves were too costly to speak, and Beatrice felt something dangerous unfurl in her chest, hope mixed with fury, because how dare he offer tenderness now, after years of careful distance, after she had finally learned to survive without it? She heard herself respond with a coolness that belied the chaos inside her. "Your Grace is kind to concern himself with my feelings after so long ignoring them. But I assure you that I have made my peace with our arrangement, and whatever conclusion you have decided upon, I shall accept with equanimity." And the formality was a shield against the part of her that wanted desperately to believe his unfinished confession, that wanted to cross the space between them and demand he complete that sentence and make real whatever fragile possibility it implied. Sebastian accepted her guardedness without protest, simply nodding as though he had expected nothing less, and said quietly, "I understand your distrust. I have given you every reason to doubt both my honor and my intentions, but I ask that you hear what I have come to tell you, even if you cannot yet believe it." And then he explained with careful precision that tomorrow at the Hastings ball he intended to announce their betrothal publicly, to produce the contract and claim her before all of London society, to transform her from wallflower to duchess in a single evening regardless of consequences to himself or his unfinished business. And Beatrice felt the room tilt slightly, because this was what she had waited for through 4 seasons of mockery. But now that it arrived, she found herself terrified, thinking that public recognition meant public scrutiny, that society's interest could be as cruel as its dismissal, that perhaps obscurity had been a kind of protection she had not properly valued. She asked the question that mattered most, her voice barely steady. "Why now? Why tomorrow when the contract allows another month? What has changed?" And Sebastian's answer came with devastating honesty. "I watched you break at the Marchfield ball. I saw what my protection through secrecy has cost you, and I realized that I would rather face whatever dangers I have been avoiding than spend another day allowing you to suffer alone." And in his eyes, Beatrice saw something she had never quite seen before, a vulnerability that matched her own, and she understood that whatever happened tomorrow would irrevocably alter both their lives, that there would be no returning to the careful distance they had maintained, and the terror of that transformation warred with a hope so fierce it threatened to undo her completely. The Hastings ballroom blazed with such extravagant illumination that evening that the 1,000 candles in their crystal chandeliers seemed to multiply through the gilt-edged mirrors lining the walls until the entire space existed in a state of almost supernatural brightness. And Beatrice felt the familiar tightening in her chest as their carriage drew up to the entrance, because this was the grandest ball of the season, the event where reputations were made and unmade, where marriage arrangements were whispered into being, and social positions were either confirmed or destroyed, and she knew that whatever Sebastian intended would happen here before London's most critical assembly. She entered with her mother and father, her sister Caroline radiant beside her betrothed Lord Winters, and Beatrice assumed her customary position near the potted palms at the ballroom's eastern edge, the location she had occupied at so many similar events, that the wallpaper pattern had become as familiar as the papers in her own bedroom. But tonight felt different, because somewhere in this glittering crowd Sebastian was present. Actually present at a social function for the first time in anyone's recent memory, and she could feel the electricity of speculation crackling through the assembled guests, like lightning before a storm. She spotted him almost immediately, because he commanded attention simply by existing, tall and dark-haired in his perfectly tailored evening clothes, standing near the orchestra with the Marquis of Hastings, and every matron in the room had oriented toward him like flowers toward unexpected sunlight, their unmarried daughters positioned with calculated casualness in his potential line of sight. And Beatrice felt doubt creep through her with cold fingers, because looking at him here in his natural element of power and consequence, she could not quite believe that this man would choose to bind himself publicly to society's most notorious failure. She watched as Lady Pemberton made her approach with her daughter Lucinda, watched as several other ambitious mothers manoeuvred their girls into his vicinity, and the old familiar shame rose in Beatrice's throat, because what had she been thinking? What delusion had possessed her to imagine that Sebastian's words last night meant anything against the reality of what London society offered him. Beautiful, accomplished girls with impeccable lineages and unquestionable prospects, when she stood here against the wallpaper where she had always stood, where she would perhaps always stand, remarkable only for her complete unremarkability. His eyes found hers across the crowded ballroom, and something in his expression made her breath stop, an intensity of focus that seemed to acknowledge her alone among the hundreds of people pressing for his attention. But perhaps she was imagining it. Perhaps she was seeing what she desperately wanted to see, rather than what truly existed. And she pressed herself deeper into the shadows, thinking that when this evening ended, and his promised announcement failed to materialize, she would need to find the strength to continue, to survive not just society's mockery, but the far more devastating pain of her own extinguished hope. Sebastian's movement through the crowded ballroom carried the deliberate quality of a man who had made an irrevocable decision and would not be deterred from its execution, and Beatrice watched with mounting disbelief as he excused himself from the cluster of admirers surrounding him, stepped away from Lady Pemberton's transparently positioned daughter, and began walking with unmistakable purpose directly toward the eastern wall, where she stood half-concealed behind the potted palms, and the whispers started immediately because everyone could see the direction of his approach, and everyone knew that nothing of significance existed in that corner, except the wallflower, who had occupied it for 4 interminable seasons. The crowd parted for him automatically, as crowds always parted for men of his rank and consequence, and Beatrice felt her heart hammering against her ribs with such violence that she thought surely everyone must hear it, thought that perhaps she should flee before he reached her, and whatever humiliation this moment contained could unfold. But her feet seemed rooted to the floor, and her eyes locked on his approaching figure, with the helpless fascination of someone watching their entire world transform before them. And she registered with some distant part of her mind that the orchestra had faltered slightly, that conversation throughout the ballroom had dropped to urgent whispers, that every eye had turned to witness the Duke of Ashcroft walking with clear intention toward society's most notable failure. He stopped directly before her, and the whispers swelled into something louder. Speculation crackling through the assembly like wildfire, and Beatrice saw Lady Pemberton's face drain of colour in her peripheral vision, saw her own mother's expression shift from confusion to dawning hope, saw Caroline grip Lord Winter's arm with white-knuckled intensity, and then Sebastian was bowing before her with the formal precision required by society's strictest protocols, his dark eyes never leaving hers, and she watched as though from a great distance as he extended his gloved hand toward her in unmistakable invitation. His voice when he spoke carried clearly enough that the nearest observers could hear every word, and he said with a formality that somehow conveyed intimacy, "My lady, would you honor me with this dance?" And the phrasing was traditional, but the context was revolutionary, because dukes did not request dances from wallflowers, did not single out unremarkable girls for public attention, did not extend their hands with such obvious intent to women whom society had collectively dismissed as beneath notice. Beatrice's hand trembled visibly as she raised it to accept his, her glove pale against his darker one, and she heard her own voice answer with a steadiness that surprised her. "The honor would be mine, your grace." And the moment her fingers touched his palm, she felt the solid reality of him, the warmth of his hand even through their gloves, and understood that this was truly happening, that whatever safety obscurity had provided was about to be stripped away forever, that she was stepping from shadow into light, and there would be no returning to the comfortable anonymity of wallpaper and dismissal. He drew her forward with gentle pressure, and she moved with him onto the dance floor where couples were forming for the next set, and she registered through the roaring in her ears that it was a waltz, the most intimate of dances, the one that required close contact and sustained connection. And as Sebastian's hand settled at her waist, and his other hand enclosed hers with careful firmness, she looked up into his face and saw there something that made her breath catch, a tenderness mixed with determination, a claiming that went beyond mere social performance, and she understood that whatever happened next would alter the fundamental truth of her existence as surely as spring alters winter, and she was terrified and exhilarated in equal measure as the music began. The waltz began, and Beatrice discovered that all their clandestine meetings in his private residence had prepared her body for this moment, even as her mind reeled with the impossibility of it, because Sebastian led with such natural authority that her feet followed his without conscious thought, their movements synchronizing with the easy grace of partners who had danced together 1,000 times before, though this was their first public performance, and she felt the solid warmth of his hand at her waist through the silk of her gown, felt the pressure of his fingers intertwined with hers, felt the shocking intimacy of being held by him before hundreds of watching eyes after years of carefully maintained distance whenever they might be observed. He drew her closer than strict propriety required, and she allowed it because denying him anything in this moment felt impossible, and she was aware with every fibre of her being that they were being scrutinized by everyone in the ballroom, that Lady Pemberton's face had gone from pale to crimson, that her mother had pressed a handkerchief to her lips, that Caroline was gripping the Marquis's arm with obvious amazement, but Sebastian's dark eyes held hers with such intensity that the watching crowd seemed to fade into insignificance, seemed to become merely backdrop to this singular moment of transformation. "You are trembling," he murmured, his voice low enough that only she could hear beneath the swelling music, and she managed a shaky breath before responding. "I am terrified that I shall wake and find this is merely another dream, another delusion born of desperate hoping." And she saw something flicker in his expression, pain perhaps, or regret, before he said with quiet firmness, "This is no dream, Beatrice. This is the beginning of what should have been yours from the first moment, what I should have given you years ago, rather than asking you to wait in shadows while I resolved matters that now seem far less important than the cost you have paid." She felt tears threatening, and blinked them back, because she would not weep here before all these people who had dismissed her, would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her overcome, and she said with more steadiness than she felt, "They are all watching us, Sebastian. They are all wondering why you would choose someone like me when you might have anyone." And his hand tightened fractionally at her waist as he answered, "Let them wonder. Let them scramble to revise their foolish assessments. Let them see what I have known these 3 years, that you possess more genuine worth than any woman in this assembly, that your grace under their cruelty revealed depths of character they cannot begin to comprehend." The music swirled around them, and Beatrice allowed herself to believe him, allowed herself to feel the truth of what was happening, rather than the fear of what might still go wrong, and she noticed how he looked at her, with an expression she had never seen him wear in public, a tenderness usually reserved for their private moments, and she understood that he was claiming her not just through words and presence, but through every visible gesture, making it clear to anyone with eyes that this was not duty or obligation, but something far more profound. The waltz reached its crescendo, and Sebastian guided her through a final turn, and as the music ended, he did not immediately release her as protocol demanded, but rather kept his hand at her waist a moment longer, his other hand holding hers with gentle possession, and he looked at her with such open affection that she heard gasps from the nearest observers, because this was not how dukes regarded contractual obligations. This was how men looked at women they genuinely treasured, and when he finally stepped back and bowed, she curtsied automatically, while her heart hammered with the knowledge that whatever came next, this moment had been witnessed by everyone who mattered in London society, and there could be no taking it back. Sebastian escorted her from the dance floor with his hand resting possessively at the small of her back, a gesture that did not escape the notice of anyone present. And before Beatrice could fully process what was happening, he guided her toward where Lord and Lady Hastings stood near the orchestra dais, and she watched with mounting astonishment as he leaned close to their host and murmured something that caused Lord Hastings' eyebrows to rise nearly to his hairline, before the older man nodded slowly and moved to signal the orchestra master. And within moments, the music ceased mid-phrase, and an expectant hush fell over the assembly as Lord Hastings raised his hand for attention, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent ballroom as he announced, "His Grace, the Duke of Ashcroft, has requested a moment of the company's attention for a matter of some importance." And Beatrice felt her knees weaken as Sebastian stepped forward onto the dais while keeping her hand firmly clasped in his, bringing her with him into full view of every person in that glittering assembly. The silence was absolute and suffocating as Sebastian surveyed the crowd with the commanding presence that had made him one of the most powerful men in England, and Beatrice could feel hundreds of eyes upon her, could see her mother's face pale with confusion and hope, could see Lady Pemberton's expression of dawning horror, could see Caroline clutching Lord Winter's arm with white-knuckled intensity, and then Sebastian's voice rang out clear and authoritative across the ballroom as he said, "I stand before you this evening to correct a misapprehension that has persisted far too long, and to claim publicly what has been mine by right and contract these 3 years past." And the collective intake of breath from the assembled guests was audible even over the hammering of Beatrice's heart. Sebastian drew from his coat a folded document sealed with his ducal crest, and held it aloft so that all could see before continuing. "Lady Beatrice Ashford has been my intended bride since the spring of 1814, bound to me by formal betrothal contract, signed and witnessed in the presence of her father and my solicitors. A contract I produce now for any who wish to verify its authenticity and date." And he handed the document to Lord Hastings, who examined it with widening eyes before nodding confirmation to the assembly, and the whispers that had begun started to swell into something louder, speculation and shock rippling through the crowd like a stone thrown into still water. Sebastian's hand tightened around Beatrice's as he continued, his voice cutting through the rising murmur with absolute authority. "The betrothal was kept confidential at my insistence due to certain family matters that required resolution before I could properly claim my bride and provide her the security and position she deserves. Matters which have now been satisfactorily concluded." And Beatrice understood that he was giving them a reason for the secrecy that protected her family's dignity, that made it seem his choice rather than desperation born of her father's debts, and she felt gratitude mix with her terror as he turned to look at her directly, with an expression of such open possessiveness that several women in the front rows gasped audibly. His final words rang out like a proclamation, formal and irrevocable, as he declared to the assembled company, "Lady Beatrice has been mine all along, promised and faithful while I resolved impediments to our union, and I announce now before you all that our wedding shall proceed within the fortnight, at which time she shall take her rightful place as Duchess of Ashcroft." And for one breathless moment, the ballroom remained frozen in stunned silence before it erupted into chaos, voices rising in exclamation and speculation, heads turning to neighbours in frantic whispered conversation. And through it all, Sebastian stood unmoved and commanding beside her, his hand never releasing hers, his presence declaring more clearly than any words that he would not be swayed or questioned, that this was accomplished fact rather than mere intention, and Beatrice stood trembling beside him as her entire world inverted in the space of a single announcement. The chaos that followed Sebastian's announcement seemed to happen both instantaneously and in slow motion, as though Beatrice were observing the scene from a great distance while simultaneously being crushed by its immediacy, and she watched with numb amazement as Lady Pemberton herself pushed through the crowd toward them, her expression transformed from its earlier contempt into something so obsequious it bordered on grotesque. And the woman who had suggested not 3 hours earlier that Beatrice accept her inevitable spinsterhood now grasped her hands with trembling fingers and exclaimed in a voice dripping with false warmth, "My dear Lady Beatrice, what wonderful news! I have always thought you possessed such quiet elegance, such understated grace that clearly His Grace recognized even if others were too blind to see." and Beatrice felt Sebastian's hand tighten protectively at her waist as she responded with perfect composure and unmistakable coolness. "How kind of you to say so, Lady Pemberton, though I confess I do not recall you expressing such sentiments during our previous encounters." And she watched the older woman's face flush crimson before she stammered some excuse and retreated into the pressing crowd. Others surged forward with similar desperation, women who had cut her direct in hallways, now claiming long-standing admiration, gentlemen who had looked through her as though she were furniture, now bowing with exaggerated deference, and Miss Hartley, whose brother had rejected even the suggestion of Beatrice's name just weeks earlier, appeared at her elbow with tears in her eyes, claiming they had always been such dear friends, such close companions. And did Beatrice remember that lovely afternoon they had spent together, though Beatrice had no memory whatsoever of any such occasion, and said so with perfect politeness that nonetheless left Miss Hartley pale and stammering. Through it all Sebastian remained at her side like a wall of granite, his presence alone enough to prevent anyone from pressing too close or becoming too familiar. And when Lord Winters approached with Caroline clutching his arm, her sister's face wet with tears of joy, Beatrice felt her composure crack slightly as Caroline embraced her and whispered, "I knew there must be some explanation. I knew you could not be as alone as you seemed." And Beatrice held her sister close while her own tears threatened, because Caroline had been kind even when kindness seemed foolish, had defended her even when defense seemed futile, and now at least one person's faith had been vindicated. Her mother appeared moments later, supported by her father, whose face bore an expression of such profound relief that Beatrice understood how heavily the secret had weighed upon him, how much he had suffered watching her endure society's cruelty, while unable to reveal the truth that would have ended it. And when her mother embraced her, she was weeping so profoundly that she could not speak, could only hold Beatrice close and stroke her hair as though she were a child again. And Beatrice felt years of tension between them dissolve in that moment, because her mother had not known, had genuinely believed her daughter destined for spinsterhood, and had grieved for it, and now discovered that grief had been unnecessary all along. Sebastian leaned close and murmured against her ear, "There is a private withdrawing room beyond the second corridor. Shall we claim a moment's peace?" And Beatrice nodded gratefully, because the press of bodies and voices was becoming overwhelming, the sudden reversal too much to process amid such chaos, and he guided her through the crowd with firm authority, his hand never leaving her waist, his expression discouraging anyone from attempting to delay their departure, and she was dimly aware of eyes following them, of whispers erupting in their wake, of the fundamental shift that had occurred in how society perceived her, but none of it felt entirely real, felt instead like something happening to someone else while she watched from behind glass. And when Sebastian finally closed the withdrawing room door behind them, shutting out the noise and spectacle, Beatrice found herself trembling so violently that her teeth chattered, and she sank onto the velvet settee while Sebastian knelt before her and took her cold hands in his warm ones, and for the first time since the announcement, she allowed herself to truly feel the enormity of what had just transpired. The silence in the withdrawing room felt sacred after the chaos of the ballroom, broken only by Beatrice's ragged breathing and the distant strains of music that had resumed beyond the closed door, and Sebastian remained kneeling before her while she struggled to compose herself, his hands warm and steady around her trembling fingers as he waited with the patience that had always characterized their private interactions, so different from the commanding authority he displayed to the world. And finally she found her voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper as she said, "I do not know how to reconcile these 3 years, Sebastian. I do not know how to simply accept that what was hidden is now revealed, and that all shall be well." And she watched his expression shift from concern to something deeper, something that looked almost like pain as he absorbed her words. He did not offer immediate reassurance or empty promises, but instead rose from his kneeling position and sat beside her on the settee, maintaining hold of one of her hands while giving her space to breathe. And when he spoke, His voice carried a weight of honesty she had rarely heard from him, as he said, "I do not expect you to simply accept it, Beatrice. I do not expect years of hurt to dissolve because I have finally done what I should have done far sooner." And she turned to look at him fully, seeing in his face an openness that the secrecy had never permitted, a vulnerability that moved something in her chest, even as her wounds remained tender. He continued, choosing his words with obvious care. "The secrecy was necessary, though that does not make it just. There were threats to my family line that required resolution, political entanglements that could have destroyed us both had our connection been known. Enemies who would have used you against me without hesitation." And she listened as he explained in terms he had never used before about attempts on his life, about machinations in Parliament that had threatened the dukedom itself, about investigations he had conducted into corruption that had made him targets of powerful men, and she understood that he was trusting her with truths he had guarded even from his closest advisers. When he finished, she sat in silence for a long moment, processing these revelations alongside everything else, and then she asked the question that had lived in her heart for months, the question that terrified her even as she forced herself to speak it aloud. "Do you love me, Sebastian, or do you merely honor an obligation you accepted 3 years past?" And she watched him go very still beside her, watched something flicker across his face that might have been surprise or fear or recognition, and the pause before his answer stretched so long that she felt her heart begin to break even before he spoke. But when his words finally came, they were not the smooth assurances of a practiced courtier, but something rougher, more real, as he said, "I do not know when obligation became something more. I cannot point to a single moment when duty transformed into desire. But I know that watching you endure society's cruelty, while I remained unable to defend you publicly, has been the greatest torment of my life. I know that your intelligence and grace and quiet strength have come to occupy my thoughts far more than mere obligation would warrant. I know that the idea of any life that does not include you has become unthinkable." And he turned to face her fully, his grey eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch as he continued, "Whether you call that love or something else I cannot say with certainty, for I have never felt its like before, but I can tell you with absolute truth that you are not mere obligation to me, Beatrice. You have not been for some time." She felt tears slip down her cheeks unbidden as she absorbed his words, searching his face for any sign of deception, and finding none. Finding instead a man who looked as uncertain and exposed as she felt. And slowly, tentatively, she lifted her free hand to touch his face, her fingers trembling as they traced the sharp line of his jaw, and she whispered, "Then perhaps we might begin again. Not as contract and obligation, but as two people attempting to build something real." And when he leaned into her touch and closed his eyes, she saw in that gesture the beginning of genuine intimacy that went beyond anything their arrangement had permitted, and for the first time since his announcement, she allowed herself to feel hope. The days following the Hastings ball transformed Beatrice's existence with a swiftness that left her reeling, as invitations that had never before borne her name now arrived in such abundance that her mother wept while sorting through them, and Lady Pemberton herself called at their residence to extend a personal invitation to an intimate dinner party, the very same woman who had suggested just weeks earlier that Beatrice accept her spinsterhood with grace, now claiming in syrupy tones that she had always recognized something special in dear Lady Beatrice, had always known she possessed qualities that would attract the most discerning of gentlemen, and Beatrice received her with perfect politeness that nonetheless conveyed precisely how transparent such revisionism appeared, her composure never wavering even as she declined the invitation with the explanation that the Duke had already claimed that evening for other plans. She found herself navigating this new social elevation with a dignity that surprised even herself, refusing to succumb to either bitterness or vindictive pleasure, understanding that true grace required her to rise above the cruelty she had endured rather than perpetuate it, And when Miss Hartley appeared at yet another gathering with desperate eyes seeking reconciliation, Beatrice accepted her stammered apology with quiet kindness, while making it clear through subtle distance that their relationship would never possess the intimacy Miss Hartley now claimed it had always held. And she watched the younger woman retreat with a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow, because she had learned too well how society's approval could vanish as quickly as it appeared. Sebastian courted her publicly with a deliberateness that spoke of genuine intention rather than mere obligation, appearing at her residence each afternoon with flowers chosen specifically for their meaning, white camellias for adoration, pink roses for grace, forget-me-nots for true love, and he took her driving through Hyde Park during the fashionable hour when all of society could observe them together, his attention focused entirely upon her as though the watching crowds did not exist, and she found herself slowly believing that his declaration in the withdrawing-room had been genuine, that the man beside her truly cared for her beyond the contract that had bound them. The evenings brought invitations to operas and theatre performances, and Sebastian secured boxes where they could be seen by everyone while maintaining enough privacy for genuine conversation. And Beatrice discovered that he possessed a dry wit she had only glimpsed during their secret meetings, a humour that emerged more freely now that secrecy no longer constrained them. And she laughed at his observations about society's sudden reversal with a lightness she had not felt in years, the sound of her own laughter startling her because she had forgotten what joy felt like when not shadowed by imminent humiliation. Society itself seemed determined to rewrite the narrative of her previous seasons, and she overheard conversations at gatherings where women who had cut her direct now claimed to have always admired her quiet elegance, her understated sophistication, her refusal to engage in the desperate husband-hunting that characterized less refined young ladies. And the revisionism was so blatant, so utterly shameless, that Beatrice might have laughed had it not been built upon 3 years of genuine suffering. But she held her tongue and smiled politely, and allowed them their delusions because she understood that society's memory was conveniently short, and that her new position depended partly upon permitting such comfortable fictions. Yet in private moments, usually late at night when she lay sleepless in her childhood bed, Beatrice struggled to reconcile the joy of Sebastian's courtship with the memories of endless mockery, struggled to simply accept happiness after so long expecting humiliation, and she found herself weeping sometimes for no reason she could articulate, tears falling silently in the darkness as 3 years of suppressed pain finally found release. And she wondered if transformation always required this strange mixing of grief and gladness, this simultaneous mourning of what was lost and celebration of what was found. And she suspected that the girl who had accepted Sebastian's arrangement 3 years prior had died somewhere in those ballrooms, and the woman emerging now was someone different, someone stronger, but also more scarred, and she was not entirely certain yet whether that transformation had been worth its cost. The wedding took place on a crisp October morning when autumn had painted London in shades of amber and gold, and the cathedral stood magnificent against a sky so blue it seemed almost unreal, sunlight streaming through ancient stained glass windows to cast jewelled patterns across stone floors worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. And Beatrice stood in the vestibule wearing her grandmother's lace veil and a gown of ivory silk that had been altered 3 times because she could scarcely believe the day was truly arriving, could scarcely trust that she would not wake to find it all an elaborate dream conjured by a desperate heart. Her father waited beside her with tears in his eyes that spoke of guilt and relief intermingled, and he whispered as they prepared to enter the sanctuary, "I am sorry, my dear, for what necessity demanded of you 3 years past, but I confess I have never seen a union that began in such darkness find its way to such light." And she squeezed his arm gently in forgiveness and understanding, because she had learned that bitterness served no purpose, and that her father's weakness had ultimately led her to a happiness she might never have discovered otherwise, though the path had been cruel beyond measure. The organ's opening notes swelled through the cathedral with a power that seemed to vibrate in her very bones, and she processed down the aisle on her father's arm, past pews filled with all of London society, past Lady Pemberton, whose smile looked strained, past Miss Hartley, who dabbed at her eyes with obvious envy, past Lord Pembroke and his mother, who had once deemed her utterly unsuitable for their family, and she held her head high as she walked, because she was no longer the wallflower they had mocked, but rather a woman who had endured their cruelty and emerged with her essential self intact and her dignity uncompromised by their shallow judgments. Sebastian stood at the altar in formal attire that emphasized his commanding presence, but it was not his ducal bearing that made her breath catch as their eyes met, but rather the expression on his face. An openness and vulnerability visible to all present that spoke more clearly than words of genuine feeling, of a love that had grown from duty into something far more profound. And when her father placed her hand in Sebastian's, she felt the slight tremor in his fingers that told her he was as affected by this moment as she was, that beneath his composed exterior he felt the weight and wonder of what they were undertaking together. The ceremony proceeded with all the traditional solemnity, the Archbishop's voice resonating through the sacred space as he spoke of duty and devotion, of the sanctity of marriage and the bonds being forged before God and witnesses. But Beatrice heard these familiar words differently now because they applied to her in a way she had never imagined during those years of social exile, and when the moment came for vows, she spoke her promises clearly and without hesitation, watching Sebastian's eyes as she pledged herself to this man who had been contract and obligation and was becoming something infinitely more precious. His own vows carried a weight that seemed to reach beyond the scripted words, his voice steady but laden with emotion as he promised to honor and cherish her, to remain faithful in sickness and health, in prosperity and adversity, until death alone should part them. And she heard in those traditional phrases everything he had left unspoken during their years of secrecy, heard apology and promise and devotion intermingled, and when he slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, she knew that whatever had brought them to this moment, the future they were building would be founded on something real and chosen rather than merely contracted and obligatory. The Archbishop pronounced them husband and wife before the assembled congregation, his words making official what had been legally binding for 3 years, but emotionally distant until recently. And then Sebastian lifted her veil with careful reverence and kissed her for the first time before all of society, their first kiss, laden with 3 years of restraint and longing and patience, and she felt in that contact a promise of intimacies yet to be discovered, of a physical connection that would mirror the emotional understanding they had been building in private. And when they finally drew apart to face the congregation as Duke and Duchess of Ashcroft, the applause that filled the cathedral felt like vindication and triumph, and the closing of one chapter, while another infinitely brighter one began to unfold before them. 2 years had passed since that October wedding, 2 years that had transformed Beatrice's existence in ways both profound and subtle, and she sat now in the morning room of their London residence as spring sunlight streamed through windows overlooking gardens she had designed herself, gardens filled with the white camellias Sebastian had brought her during their courtship, and roses in every shade from palest blush to deepest crimson. And she looked up from the letter she was composing to her mother to find her husband entering with that particular expression that still made her heart quicken even after all this time, a softness reserved only for private moments when society's eyes were not upon them. The house itself reflected their peculiar union, its library expanded to accommodate both their collections until books lined nearly every wall, comfortable chairs positioned near fireplaces for the long evenings they spent reading aloud to one another, and she had filled the rooms with warmth that the Duke's residence had lacked before her arrival, bringing light and life to spaces that had been merely grand but never truly welcoming. And Sebastian had confessed just last week that he had not understood what a home could be until she had created one within these walls that had previously served only as a place to conduct business and maintain appearances. He crossed to her now with the easy familiarity of genuine partnership, dropping a kiss on her forehead before settling in the chair beside hers, and she marveled still at how natural such gestures had become, how the contract that had bound them in cold obligation had transformed into something warmer and infinitely more precious, and when he reached for her hand, she gave it freely, their fingers intertwining with the unconscious ease of long practice. "You are well this morning?" he asked, his eyes dropping to where her other hand rested on the slight swell of her abdomen. Barely visible yet beneath the flowing lines of her morning dress, but unmistakable to anyone who knew to look, and she smiled with a contentment that would have seemed impossible during those years of social exile, those endless seasons when she had believed herself destined for spinsterhood and quiet despair. "Quite well," she assured him, watching the concern in his expression ease into something approaching joy, because they had waited for this moment with patience born of understanding that their union required time to heal from its unusual beginning before bringing new life into its midst. And she had insisted, despite his protests, that she needed those 2 years to truly believe in their happiness before attempting to share it with a child. The sound of arrival in the entrance hall interrupted their peaceful moment, and Beatrice recognized her sister's voice speaking with the butler, and she rose with Sebastian's assistance to greet Charlotte, who swept into the morning room with the particular energy that characterized her personality, her own marriage to Lord Whitmore having produced 3 children in as many years, and a relationship that appeared perfectly conventional and perfectly shallow in equal measure. Charlotte embraced her with genuine affection before stepping back to study her with knowing eyes, and Beatrice watched recognition dawn on her sister's face as she observed the subtle changes that pregnancy had begun to work upon Beatrice's figure, and Charlotte's delighted squeal brought Sebastian back into the room from where he had discreetly withdrawn to give the sisters privacy for their greeting. The morning passed in pleasant conversation over tea and cakes, and Beatrice found herself comparing her sister's marriage to her own with something approaching pity rather than envy, because Charlotte spoke of balls and parties and social conquests with breathless enthusiasm, while rarely mentioning her husband, except in terms of what he provided or permitted. And when Sebastian returned to join them, his hand found Beatrice's shoulder in a gesture of casual affection that spoke of intimacy and partnership. And she saw her sister notice the touch, and the way Beatrice leaned slightly into it, unconscious comfort that characterized their interactions now, and Charlotte's expression held something wistful, despite her apparent satisfaction with her own circumstances. After her sister departed, Beatrice remained in the morning room watching spring rain begin to fall against the windows, and Sebastian found her there an hour later, lost in contemplation of how strangely her life had unfolded, from wallflower to duchess, from mockery to love. And when he asked what occupied her thoughts, she told him truthfully that she was remembering those years of humiliation and finding herself almost grateful for them, because suffering had taught her to value what she now possessed, had taught her that happiness earned through patience and endurance held deeper sweetness than pleasure that came too easily. And he knelt beside her chair and took both her hands in his, and told her that her grace under cruelty had been what first made him truly see her, had been what transformed obligation into something far more profound, and she believed him, because 2 years of partnership had taught her to recognize truth in his voice, and she had learned finally to trust in happiness rather than waiting always for its inevitable withdrawal. The summer ball at Lady Worthington's residence 3 years after that transformative announcement found Beatrice standing in a position of honour rather than obscurity, her hand resting on Sebastian's arm as they greeted guests with the easy grace that characterized their partnership now, and she wore sapphires that matched her gown and caught the candlelight with every movement. But it was not her jewels that drew admiring glances, but rather the unmistakable radiance that came from genuine happiness, from a life built on understanding and patience rather than mere social advancement. And when she caught sight of a young woman hovering near the wallpaper in a position achingly familiar from years past, wearing a gown slightly out of fashion and an expression of quiet resignation, Beatrice felt her heart contract with recognition and memory of what such nights had once cost her in dignity and hope. She excused herself from Sebastian's side with a touch to his hand that communicated volumes in the silent language they had developed over years of partnership, and he responded with the slightest nod and a look of such understanding that it still amazed her how completely he could read her thoughts, and she crossed the ballroom with deliberate purpose toward the young woman who seemed to be trying to disappear into the damask wallpaper. And when Beatrice approached with a warm smile, the girl's eyes widened with something between terror and desperate hope that society's most elevated duchess would deign to notice her existence at all. "The music is quite lovely this evening, is it not?" Beatrice offered gently, positioning herself beside the girl in a manner that suggested companionship rather than condescension, and she watched the young woman struggle to form a response, clearly bewildered by this unexpected attention, and Beatrice continued softly, "I confess, I remember standing in precisely this spot during my 4th season, believing myself invisible to everyone, save those who took particular pleasure in remarking upon my continued unmarried state. And I wondered then if I would ever know anything beyond the particular cruelty of being society's perpetual disappointment." The girl's eyes filled with tears that she blinked back quickly, and she whispered, "Your Grace, I had heard you were once. That is to say, I did not realize." And Beatrice smiled with genuine warmth, because the young woman's confusion was understandable, given how thoroughly society had revised its assessment of the Duchess of Ashcroft, erasing from collective memory the years when Lady Beatrice Ashford had been their favourite object of pity and mockery, and she said quietly, "What they remember, and what was true, are often vastly different things, my dear, and I learned during those difficult years that worth exists independent of recognition, that patience sometimes yields rewards far beyond what desperation ever could, and that the judgment of those who see only surfaces tells us nothing of our essential value." She felt rather than saw Sebastian's approach, his presence a warmth at her back, and when she glanced up at him, the expression on his face held such tenderness that even after 3 years of marriage it still made her breath catch, and he bowed slightly to the young wallflower before extending his hand to Beatrice and saying, "My dear, I believe they are beginning the next set, and I find I cannot bear to watch others dance when I might have the pleasure of partnering you myself." And she placed her hand in his with the absolute trust that had replaced the trembling uncertainty of years past. And as they moved toward the dance floor, she looked back once to see the young woman watching them with an expression of dawning hope, as though witnessing their evident devotion had suggested possibilities she had not previously dared to imagine. Dear listener, perhaps you have known seasons of waiting when your worth went unrecognized, when the shallow judgments of those around you seemed to define your possibilities and limit your horizons, when you wondered if patience was merely another name for foolishness, and if hope was a luxury you could no longer afford to maintain. And I would remind you gently that the truest value often remains invisible to eyes trained only to see surface accomplishments and conventional measures of success, that the deepest connections sometimes require time and testing before they reveal their full potential, and that endurance through difficulty can forge a strength and wisdom that easy pleasure never could produce. The world may tell you that happiness delayed is happiness denied, that worth unrecognized is worth non-existent, but I have learned through years of testing that patient cultivation of genuine understanding yields harvests far richer than hasty grasping after shallow approval, that the love built slowly through accumulated moments of true seeing holds depths that instant attraction can never plumb, and that the person who values you in private while the world remains blind may prove more precious than 1,000 who celebrate you only when celebration becomes fashionable. So if you find yourself standing against the wallpaper of your own particular season, overlooked and underestimated, know that your story is not yet complete, that hidden worth has its own timeline for revelation, and that the patience to endure until recognition arrives, or the strength to thrive without it, are both forms of quiet courage that deserve honoring. May you find peace in your own essential value, regardless of who sees or fails to see it. May patience bring you either the recognition you deserve or the wisdom to no longer require it. May your waiting seasons teach you truths that easy success could never reveal. And may you discover that the deepest happiness often comes not from being universally admired, but from being truly known and genuinely cherished by those rare souls capable of seeing beneath surfaces to the complexity and beauty that resides within. If this story has touched you, I invite you to subscribe to Regency Romance Tales, where every week we explore the transformative power of patience, the triumph of hidden worth, and the particular magic that occurs when love is built slowly and surely, rather than grasped hastily and lost easily. And I wish you gentle dreams and the quiet confidence that your own story is unfolding exactly as it must, revealing its meaning in its own perfect time.